Hello everyone, and welcome back to Plantastic Research. This is video 5 of the series, and today I will be talking about pollinators and the different types of pollinators and how they're beneficial to plants. Now, we've been on this recent discussion and lessons on plants and their different types of behaviors, but today I want to touch on some of the animals that help plants grow as well. In my last video, I touched a little bit on the different types of pollinators, such as bees and butterflies, and there are many more that I want to touch on as well. In our last discussion, we also talked about the different types of the life cycle of the plant, and I'll tie in a little bit of that, a little bit more information of that as well into today's lesson, because I feel like it's really important for us to talk about that and for us to discuss that. Also, I want to mention that for today's lesson, it's going to be a little bit more interactive. There's a lot of new vocabulary that I want to introduce you guys to, and a few things that I feel like if I did tell you about, then you would find very interesting. And this is also going to be one of my favorites that I've gone over today. So let's get right into it. So first, I want to talk about what are pollinators. Well, it's actually not that uncommon of what a pollinator does, but I want to explain a little bit more of it. Well, first off, a pollinator is anything that carries pollen from the male part or the stamen of the plant towards the female part or the stigma of another flower. And from our previous video, I talked about how the different types of body parts, not body parts, but the different types of plant parts, and the stamen is the male productive organ in a flower, and the stigma is the female productive organ in a flower as well. They are used to help plants fertilize and therefore grow or produce into fruits that we eat, the blooms that you will see on flowers or many young saplings, or their younger versions to help them grow from young to mature plants as well. Some examples of pollinators, some of the most common are bees, wasps, moths, butterflies, birds. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the birds part. Specifically, hummingbirds are pollinators. Not all birds are pollinators, but certain birds called like hummingbirds and other types of small birds. Not very large ones, but sometimes birds, the birds that are pollinators have to have a special type of, I would say, tool or body part that they use to help them pollinate as well. So not all birds are pollinators, but mostly, and I'll get into the birds that are pollinators, a few other birds that are pollinators as well. Flies are pollinators as well, and sometimes smaller animals such as bats are pollinators. And actually, I thought that was really interesting, so hope you guys find that interesting as well. So yes, so basically a pollinator is anyone who carries pollen or helps carries pollen between plants, from plant to plant, or one plant to another plant. Also, I'm going to talk about how these different types of pollinators use the pollen itself from the plant to their own benefit. Because in case you have, I know sometimes people would say, where does honey come from? Well, pollen is actually used to help create honey as well. So when you hear honey, you'll sometimes hear pollen. And I'll get into that in a second about how bees use that to create pollen. But yes, this is what a pollinator is. Now, let's get into the different types of pollinators that there are. So first I want to talk about how do bees pollinate, or how do they use their pollination to, how is pollination helpful for them? Well, we're going to answer how do bees pollinate? When bees collect nectar and pollen from a flower or a plant, some of the pollen from the stamen of the plant attaches to the hairs or the body of the bee. As the bee moves from flower to flower, the pollen on its body spreads, allowing other flowers to then reproduce. And as you can see at this picture, there's not specifically, but there some of the pollen from the bee while it's collecting nectar, which is then used to make honey, will then attach to the bee, and they will fly all around to different flowers and different plants, and that pollen will then attach or fall off its body as it moves around on the plant, and will then cause it to spread. And as that pollen spread, it helps the plant reproduce. And reproduction in plants also is helping them make, helps them make their produce. And a little fun fact about nectar. Nectar is a very sticky substance, so have you ever wondered why honey is so sticky sometimes? That's because the nectar that the bees collect, they take it back to the hive, and then they use all the nectar and they mix it together, and but that's a topic for a different video. But nectar is a very sticky substance, and that's why it helps, and that's why bees go from flower to flower in the first place. And as a result, they collect the pollen. They don't actually go to the flower for the pollen. They use it, but it attaches to them. And as they fly around, it then attaches to the other plants. Now we're going to move on to the next pollinator. So now we're going to talk about how butterflies pollinate. Butterflies pollinate in a very similar way towards bees. Butterflies drink nectar as their common food. Similar to bees, when a butterfly lands on a flower to drink its nectar, some of the pollen sticks to the legs and some of its body parts. Now this is really similar to how some of the bees pollinate as well. Like I said, when we were discussing the bees, a lot of the pollen would naturally stick onto the insect itself, and this is actually a very common trend for a lot of insects that do normal pollination. And because bees and butterflies take the nectar, that pollen is already initially going to stick to them because they're all in the flower and they're all in the blooms and everything. So that's why it's very common, and you'll see a common trend of butterflies and bees having pollen stick to them. Let's move on to the next one. Now we're going to talk about hummingbirds and how they pollinate. Well, specifically all birds and how the majority of birds that do pollinate. Birds such as hummingbirds and honey creepers are key pollinators for flowers and plants. Hummingbirds have really long beaks, so as they go to retrieve nectar from a flower, the pollen then clings onto its beak, and as it goes from flower to flower, the pollen spreads. Now, once again, this is a very common trend with most of the animals and insects that pollinate. Usually the pollen will stick onto either a body part or a body part of theirs. Specifically, the butterflies and the bees, they stick on maybe its body or wings, while as the hummingbird, it will stick onto its beak. And hummingbirds have very small beaks, so as they move from plant to plant, it injects sort of like a needle. Not really, but it kind of does something similar, as it has a long, sharp beak that is very thin. So the more plants that it does, the more pollen that extends on the beak that will then spread from plant to plant and flower to flower. And that is how some of the birds that are, and use particularly smaller birds, not very large. Hummingbirds are really small. So it's very easy for them to pick up pollen or for the pollen to attach to their body when they are collecting from flowers. So that is why hummingbirds are very good pollinators, and it's very important for them to pollinate. Because if not, a lot of the times, the different pollinations that work together help in different ways. So it's very important to keep in mind that a hummingbird is very important in the pollination. And so are honey creepers. And I inserted a picture of a hummingbird down here for a reason. It's the flower, and you can kind of see how thin the beak is. It's not very large. Compared to other birds, but it is and it really helps a lot with the process. So let's move on to the next one. So now I want to discuss a very unique form of pollination in the form of pollination. And these are as a result of flies. A female fly will lay its eggs onto a flower. When the larvae or the baby flies hatch, they will begin to feed on the flower or little parts of seedlings that are growing, such as seeds or fruit. And that will cause the fly, and as they grow, other flowers around them will begin to start attracting scents. Flower scents usually will deceive them into visiting or laying its eggs. They are causing the flow of pollination. They will leave scents as a result to therefore carry on the flow of pollination as well. And this is a little bit different from the bees and butterflies and hummingbirds, because this is a more form of the production or the life cycle of the fly itself. And this is how sometimes life cycles of different animals can help with pollination as well. And this is why flies, not the most common form of pollination, but a very important part because it's a lot different than just, because flies don't rely on nectar, they have a different use of the flowers and therefore helps with pollination. And this is a little fly here that I inserted to demonstrate how the pollination process works. Now, there are no eggs, but there are generally the laying of eggs that cause the different types of behaviors that will lead to further pollination in other plants and flowers. Now, let's move on to our last pollinator. So I want to finish off with a very interesting pollinator, bats. Now, when you think of pollination, you wouldn't exactly think of bats, but yes, bats are very key pollinators in the pollination process. And how do they do this? Well, similar to the common trend of pollination processes, bats drink nectar as well, particularly smaller bats. As the bat drinks the nectar from the flower, the pollen will stick to its body, and as the consumption process of nectar for the bat continues from flower to flower, the more pollen will spread. And this is also very common with the hummingbird, butterfly, and bee. And you'll find there are a lot of other animals that pollinate as well. And if you're ever interested, I'd recommend looking up some pollinators that I may not have covered, and I will cover more soon in the future. But I really do think that pollination is really cool, and I feel like the way that it's done isn't really the way that maybe have been like interested, but it's a very nice and very common process. And without the pollination, we wouldn't have a lot of the things we have now, like bees, some medicines, or things like that. So that's why pollination is really important. And I just want to take the time to say thank you all for viewing my video. This is week number 5, and I hope that you all enjoyed today's lesson. And next week, I have something very excited in stock when it comes to next week's video. And I hope you all have a very nice day and enjoy your day. Have a nice day. Thanks.